The Christ myth theory is the idea that the person that we know of, Jesus Christ, never existed as a physical human being on this planet. And then they usually posit some type of alternative explanation for the origin of Christianity, such as Jesus was just an amalgamation of other mystery religion figures who were running around in the religious atmosphere during the first century, and Jesus was just the Jewish version of this. And so a lot of times they'll point to parallels. They say, here's really Jesus, here's a piece of him there, this piece of him there. Another thing that sometimes happens is people may not do that as much, but maybe they'll just say the early Christians were basically notorious hallucinators and ultimately fabricators. And so through what they perceived to be religious revelation, basically, hallucinations and their own imagination, came up with this character, but later generations of Christians turned it in to a real historical person, even though he never did exist in the first place. There's different variations, but the main idea is he never existed as a figure of history. That's the big idea.
Yeah. What are some of the, when we look at historical writings and historical evidence of where we can look back and see the existence of Christ, and I know you're going to mention Scripture, but why do you think it is that people don't look at the Scripture as historical? Because we have the Gospels of, the four Gospels that give us a testimony of Christ, that reveal Christ to us, and then we have of the other writings in the New Testament. But why is it people tend to not look historically and want to account the Scriptures as historical, but they'll listen to, they'll look at any other historical writings and say, yeah, that's accurate, with less scriptural manuscripts and yet less evidence there. But when it comes to Scripture, it's like, no, even though there's many different, trying to think of the word, many different scripts of Scripture that we have, many different things that have been found with Scripture, they want to look at it and say, well, it's not historical. Why do you think that is the case?
Well, sort of right during what's called the Enlightenment, scholars started looking at the Bible differently, for the most part, than they had previously. And a lot of that began with what's called German higher criticism. But essentially what non-Christian, or more maybe you would call moderate or theologically liberal Christians, began doing is try to attempt a project to separate what they felt was real history in the Scriptures and what was fabrications or legends. And that's been going on, people have heard in recent years, in the 80s and 90s, the Jesus Seminar, Bart Ehrman. I mean, the list goes on and on of that type of Jesus scholarship. And when you don't hold the Bible as inerrant, authoritative as the Word of God, you will end up doing something like that. Or if you have a naturalistic predisposition, a way of viewing the world that says, if there is a God, he does not interact in our universe in the way the Bible portrays him. For example, we all know dead men don't rise. This book has a dead man rising central to it. That couldn't be real. So what really did happen? So there's this presupposition about what are called miracles being possible in the first place. So it's actually the philosophy informs the way the scholars do their history. So you add all those things together, and then with the Christ myth theory, they're basically saying, look, there's so much miraculous here. I mean, that is there really anything that's true? Because what has happened is a lot of people notice you really can't separate Jesus away from the miraculous. For example, they'll isolate some of his sayings that they think are authentic or older. Now, I don't necessarily agree with this kind of stratification, but a scholar will do that. But then they find the saying right next to it, or the point of the whole story Jesus was telling, is something that is in relationship to a prediction he's making about his own death, or a prediction about the end of the age, or a prediction about one of his disciples, or something where he gets a very high Christology about himself, where he speaks of himself as the Son of Man from Daniel. And so you really can't separate out the sayings of Jesus from these deeds that are indeed miraculous. And so Christ's mythos basically have went the extra step in a sense and just said, we don't ever think he existed in the first place. That's some of my opinion about it, because here's what I'm trying to say. Secular scholarship has viewed Jesus with these kinds of lenses for a long time, and the Christ mythicist people, even though they're generally speaking not scholars themselves, in some ways they're just taking this next step of unbelief that is going on.
Yeah. And that's kind of what I've seen too with the people that I've engaged with, is a lot of times when they quote scholars of people to try to back up their theory, they do quote the liberal scholars or people that, I mean, you and I probably would not say, yeah, that's not somebody I would get my information from or would reference for biblical things. You know, I'd go to somebody more sound or more solid in the theology, but they do tend to go that way for more liberal scholars and people like the Jesus Seminar that you mentioned, Bart Ehrman, who wrote many things against, trying to discredit scriptures and Jesus, and so many others as well. Talking about the myths, because you mentioned it earlier, is one of the things that people do tend to do is try to say that we get Jesus from these different pagan religions in the beginning. And a lot of times I see it associated with Egypt and Horus. Maybe talk a little bit about that. How do we respond to someone when they bring those up? And because, like I said, that's something that I've been getting a lot. Like, well, Jesus is just coming from Egypt. It's just stories taken from there. He's just Horus repackaged. How do we best respond to someone with that?
Well, one thing real quick I want people to be aware is that actual scholars in this area who would describe themselves as holding to the Christ myth theory or being Christ mythicists, there actually aren't any really well-known scholars that hold to it. So even the most theologically liberal scholar thinks it's ridiculous that Jesus did not exist. For example, Rudolf Bultmann, who said we need to demythologize the New Testament, he's no longer alive, but he basically said if somebody thinks Jesus didn't exist, they're a madman. So he was the most liberal scholar of his day. He's an example. You mentioned the Jesus Seminar. John Dominic Crossan, one of the brightest lights associated with the Jesus Seminar, he's actually debated a man named Richard Price in writing. And J.D. Crossan, he thought it was wild that somebody still would think that Jesus didn't exist, and he debated someone who did. We mentioned Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman wrote a book called Did Jesus Exist? And in the book, he defends the historical existence of Jesus. So even though he is an agnostic and all that, he recognizes Jesus' existence, and he even recognizes, even using his methodology, there's still things that he can know for certain about Jesus, even with that. So when we talk about Christ myth scholars, there's very few of them, first of all, because very few scholars who understand their trade would ever buy into this. The two exceptions really right now are Richard Carrier, who got a PhD in ancient history, basically, from Columbia. He's a younger guy. And Robert Price, whom I mentioned. Those are really the only two guys who are specialists in this field that I'm aware of who are actually scholars who buy this. The other people, it doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong or they're not smart, but they're just not at the same level of those other guys, such as Dan Barker, the preacher turned atheist, Earl Doherty, who wrote the Jesus Puzzle, the Zeitgeist movie by Peter Joseph. I mean, that stuff is just, it's bad. It's bad research. G.A. Wells, he was a professor of German literature. And then Frank Zimler, I mean, he's a smart guy. He's an atheist, but this is in his area, Even looking over at my friend David Fitzgerald, he's smart enough guy. He's written books on this, but he's just not his area. They're out of their depth. My point is that scholars of all types agree, because they know you can't remove Jesus out of history and still explain history the way you need to explain history, especially the rise of Christianity. So now, remember, just because a scholar say something or don't say something doesn't make it right, but the question we have to ask is, why is it that it's only the younger atheists who spend a lot of time online who are buying into this theory? Maybe there's something besides just the historical facts that's leading them to say they don't think Jesus ever existed. So I just want to clarify that first, if I could, Ricky.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you asked about Horace. Now, the guy that I'm going to be debating, Richard Carrier, he doesn't think Horace is actually a good example of one of these parallels. He says the Christ mythers should not use it. So some Christ mythers are coming out against their own, saying, hey, this is not a good example. But, for example, James Fraser, who wrote a book on these kind of parallels, he says that Horace was born in the swamps. He doesn't know anything about a star or wise men, but yet you'll see a lot of claims on the internet now. And James Fraser was a guy who did hold to a lot of these parallel views. He wrote something called The Golden Bough. But a lot of these parallels, Horace was born of a virgin on December 25th. He was born in a cave. His birth was announced by a star in the east. He was attended to by 3 wise men. Just a few things, just to, even before we talk about Horace first, is that the Bible never says that 3 wise men came to Jesus when he was born. First of all, it doesn't give a number of the Magi. Second of all, if you read carefully, you'll notice that the men who came who are wise did not come right when Jesus was born. They came later when he was a younger child. And if you read the accounts carefully, you'll be able to see that. So it's not relevant anyway. December 25th, even Richard Carrier, who is a Christ mythicist, he says, why do you guys use December 25th? Because that's not part of the Christian narrative in the first place. So that's irrelevant anyway. And the funny thing is, though, a lot of times they'll say December 25th, but a lot of times they still can't find a lot of times the claims they say about these people aren't not people, but these mystery religion figures. A lot of times they're not actually in the record in the first place. You see what I'm saying? So we actually go and look at the sources, and we don't see it there. Is a big problem. But let me read something. This is from a scholar specifically on Horace, a man named Ron Leproham from Toronto, and he pointed out that because sometimes these guys would say that Horace was called the Holy Child, and he pointed out that the word son in ancient Egyptian means to come, but the guys who based their claims on this, such as Kuhn and Harper, they got the syntax all wrong. And here's a quote. In any event, the name Isa simply does not exist in Egyptian. The name Jesus is Greek, derived from a universally recognized Semitic name, Yeshua, born by many people in the 1st century. My point about that, sometimes it gets a little confusing. My point is that they'll make these claims based upon linguistics. Like they'll say, oh, the name was similar, or they were the son too. Here's Jesus. And you go and look, and you see the experts in these fields don't agree with them. They're all wrong. They simply just have a lot of bad research. But the thing is, when these claims are brought out real quick, it's hard to answer them all at once. And so they'll say things, and you just can't find evidence for it. It's like somebody said, oh, Horace was supposed to reign 1,000 years. Nobody can find any evidence that that's the case, that Horace was supposed to do that. They'll say he walked on water. Nobody can find evidence of that. Now, it's true Horace was thrown into the water. He was thrown into the water, but that's not the same thing as walking on water. And these go like this down the road. Here's another thing. A lot of times when they quote from some source in relationship to these ancient deities, they're quoting from sources which post-date Christianity, or sources which are supposed to go back before Christianity, but our first actual copy of the source is after Christianity had already got off the ground. My point is, a lot of times they're quoting from things in relationship to these religions, but the sources themselves are after Christianity had already come into existence. there's a few things. Number one, religions change over time. So if we're quoting from a text in relationship to this person, and it's supposed to go back 1,000 years or whatever, the religion could have changed a lot, and we found these religions have changed a lot. So it doesn't mean that 1,000 years before it's the way they did it, just because they're talking about the same practice or something today. And the other thing is that it doesn't really prove that the parallel is there. And even if there is a parallel between Jesus and some mystery religion figure, you still have to do the work to show the Christians actually borrowed it and put it onto Jesus. The parallel alone actually doesn't even get you what you need. Then you have to show that they did borrow it. And no one really has any evidence of that, even if they do so some kind of parallel. Just some things to note.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, brother. That's well, definitely. I think you mentioned that zeitgeist. I don't even know if I'm saying it right, but the zeitgeist. You mentioned that, and I think a lot of times we get too much information. Now, there's a lot of information on the internet, a lot of good information, but there's also stuff like that movie and stuff like other things that people put up, and like you said, to try to discredit Christ and just throw out a lot of things there, because that's what I get from one person in particular when I have these conversations. They will throw something out, you try to address that, and then like you mentioned, then they'll just try to throw you all these different things at you, to try to disprove Christ. And so what are some of the things that you would want to share with us about this that would be really helpful for us in engaging people who come up and talk to us and say that they just don't believe Jesus existed?
Well, some of it does depend on context. I first ran into the Christ myth theory when I was witnessing on the streets, basically around the Arizona State University campus. And it's difficult in those contexts to really have to be honest, a more academic type of discussion about this. If you're really going to go that route with the person, it's difficult to do. But I would say that actually the first thing Christians need to do is to just know their New Testament better. Because if you know the New Testament well, it will actually disprove a lot of what they say right away. And the other thing is that I don't want to jump immediately to extra biblical sources to try to, quote, prove the existence of Jesus, because the New Testament is the most superior source by far. So I'm not going to immediately jump to an inferior source, such as Suetonius, for example, just because the person I'm speaking with doesn't like the New Testament for whatever reason. I'm going to stick with the best source. That's a good way to do history. Secondly, even though I do believe we should debate these things and engage in these things, but if we're talking strictly about a witnessing situation, we don't just want to convince people that Jesus existed alone. We want to convince them by the grace of God that the Jesus of the New Testament exists now, and is returning. And so my point is that mere existence will only even get us so far. And I realize that if a person genuinely believes somehow they've been deceived that Jesus never existed, it would be difficult for them to then say, I'm going to trust Jesus, because, you know what I'm saying, they don't even think he's real.
Right.
So I'm not saying it's not important, but I'm just trying to say to keep our eye on the ball about what really is important. Now, with that being said, the New Testament is the starting place. We've got to remember as Christians, the New Testament is actually an anthology or a library of documents. And so the New Testament documents is a better way to refer to it, because you have multiple sources even within the canonical literature. So yeah, there's 27 books, but Matthew is a source, Mark is a source, Luke, Acts is a source, the corpus of John is a source, so that's John, Revelation, the epistles of John, the Pauline corpus is a source, the book of Hebrews is a source, 1st and 2nd Peter is a source, Jude is a source, James is a source. See, those are all actually different sources because they're authored and penned by different people. Now, of course, once you begin talking to somebody who goes by standard, so-called modern scholarship, they'll think that only 7 of the 13 letters attributed by Paul were actually written by him. And so you could be aware of that. I'm not saying you need to buy into that presupposition. In fact, you shouldn't. But they'll say, well, yeah, Paul's a source, but 7 of them are real. The other 6 are forgeries anyway. For example, Bart Ehrman wrote a book called Forgery, in which he says this. They'll say that 1st and 2nd Peter are forgeries. They'll say this kind of stuff. And so to be aware of that, still, that's not true, but even if it was, you still have early Christians that are writing these documents and believing these things, and they're not claiming to be writing myths. They're not claiming to tell you just once upon a time tales. And in fact, Luke begins his gospel with a prologue, and this is what I mean by Christians know your New Testament. Open up Luke chapter 1, read those first 4 verses, and you can see right away Luke is saying that I investigated, I spoke to eyewitnesses. These things are things I want you to know for sure. I want you to know that they're certain that they happened. I did my best to put them in the right order, all that kind of stuff. And so that lets you know that this guy is not claiming to just write, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. He's saying he's doing something different. Now, a hardcore Christ myther just says, well, they're lying or something like that. But that lets us know right away they're not writing the same types of books that you read when you read the mystery religions. Same thing with Paul when he says, I received something and now I hand it over to you. Paul uses that language a lot. He'll say that what I received, I also give to you. That's a sort of a flag to let you know this is oral tradition being passed on or something like that. John, the end of John says that I saw these things. I was a witness to these things. You got Peter saying we didn't follow after cleverly devised myths, but things that we know we were eyewitnesses of His majesty. My point is that the New Testament doesn't claim to be the same type of thing. And we can believe that, but even if you read the other literature, for example, if you start reading stuff about Dionysus or some other ancient Greek god, you'll see the whole environment is different. And I would even say when you read such things like the Gnostic Gospels, like the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, you'll notice even those are different than the canonical Gospels as well. First of all, they're way later. They're past the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. So Philip was probably written around 250. Well, Philip would have died by then, so he couldn't even been an eyewitness in the first place. We've only got one copy of this Gospel of Philip, first of all. Second of all, if you read these Gospels, these Gnostic Gospels, you'll notice there's only one place that's ever named in them, Jerusalem. Sometimes they'll say Judea or something like that they get from the New Testament. But as far as like a proper city that I've been able to find, Jerusalem is the only city you're going to get out of them. Festivals and feasts that John mentions, for example, a lot in the New Testament, you don't see those. They don't play into the Gnostic Gospels. My point is the first-hand knowledge, the experience that a person would have only if they were there on the ground in first-century Palestine, it's absent from these Gnostic Gospels because they weren't there, and they're not very Jewish either, these Gnostic Gospels. You can tell they're written by Greeks who are more influenced by Platonic and Neoplatonism in their philosophy anyway. And so I'm just telling Christians that just because a non-Christian doesn't trust the New Testament and they'll chide you or mock you or whatever the case is, that's no reason for us to abandon it, especially since it is the best source, hands down. And the non-Christian has got to be able to explain the data dump of literature output that happened in the first century, all surrounding this one man. See, that's unprecedented in history, the way this went down. Not even Socrates had this type of ripple effect around his existence. Socrates, great ancient philosopher, his record as far as what people wrote about him, how soon it was, and all that, doesn't compare to all these different strands writing about Jesus within the lifetime of when the eyewitnesses would have been around anyway. The New Testament is unique simply in the fact that you've got this giant data dump, boom, all this literature. How do you explain that big bang of Christian literature without a historical Jesus, and I would even say without a resurrection? And a lot of times throwing the Christ myth theory out, generally speaking, would actually don't realize the weight that is on their shoulders that they would need to show to back up their statements they're making. Generally speaking, they're naive and ignorant just how big a deal what they're saying is. And if we were sort of looking at them strictly through the eyes of scholarship, they generally don't understand how bad it makes them look, because it makes it seem like a person really has no discernment, is gullible, and is not able to read historical sources. Now, I'm not saying you should say that, and that's not a reason alone to change or anything. And, of course, the person is probably looking at the Christians the same way, saying, you believe a man walked on water, and you believe a man rose another man from the dead, John, and, the book of John, and you got Lazarus. You believe X, Y, Z, that kind of stuff. But we just got to understand that when you take Jesus out of the first century and the second century doesn't make sense anymore. And so that's why I would say try to explain it without Jesus. But the problem is a person has to understand some about the first and second century to be able to do that, because generally speaking, they don't understand what they're even saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and being someone that goes out on the streets, and we do open air preaching, and we get in conversations with people, and very presuppositional in our apologetics. We do have times where people will tell us to use something other than the Bible to defend the Bible. And like you said, it's very important for us not to throw out the Scriptures, because that's our ultimate authority. That's the greatest source that we have. And so, and the way you said it, we don't need to go right away to lesser writings or lesser things to try to prove the existence. And ultimately, we do understand that salvation is a gift from God, and so it's God going to be the one that opens up that person's heart to see the truth. But we do still want to engage with people because we love them, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have this type of show, when I wanted to have you come on and we talked about the Christ myth, because it is something that I'm starting to see more of. And maybe it's these younger guys, like you said, that are just because they're so inadamant of wanting to not believe in Jesus and say that he doesn't even exist. And, so it's something that I've seen a little bit of an increase with in the people that I've engaged with, and definitely want to be able to better have better communications with them, out on the streets. And like you said, definitely knowing our Bibles is where we need to start for sure.
Right. So if a person was faithfully making sure that they let a person know that the New Testament is reliable and that there is no other source to get the type of information we need to have about Jesus and all this type of stuff, and I would say that's, for lack of a better word, established, then it is true there's some extra biblical sources that are non-Christian that do talk, sometimes briefly, sometimes a little more at length, about Jesus as a historical figure. And I don't think it's wrong at some point to mention them, but I just want to make sure that we've got our order right as far as what we hold to, and then how we use corroborative evidence. So just to name some few, and maybe we could talk about some of these if we wanted, but Tacitus, that's a Roman historian. He's sort of an aristocrat. He wrote around 115 A.D., and he wrote some things about Jesus, and he talks a little bit about his disciples. He talks about the crucifixion. He talks about the spread and persecution of Christianity. Suetonius, another ancient historian, and he wrote a number of works. You get similar things out of him, but you can also get out of him the fact that Jesus was even worshipped. Josephus, now he's a non-Christian source, but he is Jewish, and he is writing probably even within the first century itself, and in his work you get a lot of things about Jesus. It's a pretty detailed, compared to some of the other shorter ones, paragraph really is about what it is. However, the Josephus passage, I would say, has about 5 places, 5 sentences, 5 phrases is the better way to put it, that clearly have been tampered with to make them basically sound a little more sanctimonious or religious. Basically, you could tell because you could realize there are things a non-Jew or a non-Christian would not have written about Jesus. However, hardly any scholar thinks that the whole passage is an interpolation, meaning the whole passage has just been inserted in there. Some do, but it's rare, because it does seem to fit what Josephus is talking about. The vocabulary used to describe Jesus is very Joseph. It's like something Josephus would write. And the things that he says about him, when you take out those places, which some manuscripts do attest to, there's some Arabic manuscripts that do attest to the shorter, more mundane reading about Jesus that Josephus has, and you look at those, and the problematic places are gone, and the things he says about him are things that really anybody could say if they're just talking about a historical figure. Not only that, Josephus mentions James, and when he mentions James, it's in another place, and he simply says James, the brother of the so-called Messiah, or the one who was called Messiah. And the way he writes it is offhand, and if there was no preceding passage in which this person who was called Messiah named Jesus, because he says James, the brother of Jesus, the so-called Messiah, if that passage before wasn't there, it wouldn't make sense that Josephus is trying to tell you about James, whose brother was Jesus' so-called Messiah, unless he had already spoken about him. In the James passage, has no tampering or anything. It's more incidental. Pliny the Younger, he was a Roman governor writing around 112. He was in Turkey. He was writing, Asia Minor, and he actually tortured some Christians to get information out of them, and he had some information as he was actually persecuting them in his area. And you get a little bit about Jesus there as well as some practices by the early Christians. A key thing that Pliny says is that they worship Christ as a god. And he talks about communion. He says they ate bread, but of an ordinary kind. And he's speaking to the emperor there. And then you also have a Greek satirist who made fun of the Christians, and a man named Lucian. And in his writings, he describes Jesus as a crucified sophist. So that's like the bad philosopher who would trick people who got crucified. Another man named Marabar Serapion, I believe he was kind of a philosopher himself, and he was in jail writing a letter to his son, and offhand he says the Jews crucified their wise king. He makes a reference to Jesus. And then there's also Thales, and you have a brief reference, it seems, to the darkness, the mysterious darkness that took place in Palestine in his writings. Those writings are all within about 150 years of Jesus. If you go out a little further, you're going to get more. Now, of course, a Christ mythicist will say there's arguments against all of those, or those are bad, or they're all fabrications, or they got their information from Christians, things like that. They have whole books about why those sources aren't good either. But that leads me to this point, which is this. The Christ mythicist theory leads its proponents to adopt a historiography of evasion. What I mean by that is this. If you hold to the Christ myth theory, you've got to play dodgeball. So every time you've got a piece of evidence, whether it's literature or archaeology from, the first 200 years after Jesus' death, you have to find a way to move out of its way. You have to evade it. You have to say it's been interpolated, or there's all these inventive ways they do it. But you'll notice they can never just take it at face value. They can't take it for what it's worth. They have to evade it because it's harmful to their thesis. And some of the ways they evade it are very ad hoc, meaning kind of after the fact. They're not really good explanations, but it's what you have to do if you're going to hold to the Christ myth theory is basically play dodgeball with historical sources. It's not a good way to do history at all, but that's what they do time and time again.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know when I was looking up some information on this, I did see that they did try to attack Josephus and use that, and you pointed it out already, that there were tamperings in it, and they've their whole thing was it's been discredited. I don't even know why people still use it, so I'm glad you addressed that there. Yeah, it's definitely, they have to play that dodgeball, like you said, because every time you get into those conversations, they have to evade. because the history is there, the proof is there. Christ did exist, like you said earlier, with these liberal scholars. They don't even say that he didn't exist, and so it's definitely something that hopefully we don't see a real big growth in it. I hope that there's not more and more that tend to come out of this theory. But it is something that we need to be aware of and be able to have some of this information and study. And like you said, have some of these lesser historical accounts, but they're still important to have to be able to share with people and to know about them as well. Want to tell us a little bit, because we're running low on time, but want to tell us a little bit about this debate you have coming up?
Yeah, there's a local atheist radio show here in Arizona. It's called Unbelievers Radio, and they're having myself and Richard Carrier on Thursday. I think the date is April 3rd or 2nd, whichever that Thursday is right there. And you can listen to it on Unbelievers Radio. Richard Carrier is like the biggest and brightest and most prolific Christ mythicist writer there is. He's got a book called On the Historicity of Jesus. That's kind of the magnum opus. It's, I think 712 pages total. It's actually not that long. It's this copy is 696 pages. But he's got a lot of books on it, a lot of writing on it. And I'll be dialoguing with him about this. I've debated a guy he kind of trained or influenced before, a man named David Fitzgerald. Those you can find online. If you just put Did Jesus Exist? Vocab, Malone, Radio, David Fitzgerald, you can find those videos. But that's when that is. People could check it out. And I hope to do more of these because even though I know it doesn't have foothold in the scholarly world, I worry that younger people who don't really know much about history will buy into it, and it's damaging. It's damaging in a lot of ways for them to buy into this idea. And also Christians should just care about truth, And so
right.
I'm doing this, and I'm willing to do more.
Well, that's awesome, brother. I know I'm going to be definitely tuning in or grabbing the podcast on that Unbelievers Radio. I'm going to check it out because I want to learn more too, and that's why I was glad to have you come on and talk about it because, like I said, I haven't had many conversations with people about this, but I've had a few recently, and it seems to be a growing thing, especially with a lot of stuff that's online. People watch a lot of YouTube and get a lot of information from there from people who are coming on and professing to be a scholar or professing to be somebody who has some knowledge on it. And that Zeitgeist, I don't even know if I'm saying that right, but that movie, and I know that's one of the things that people kept sending me. Yeah, Zeitgeist, and that's something that people kept sending me, saying you got to watch this because this will prove to you, these things, and so people get a lot of information from there. But brother, I really do appreciate you coming on and taking the time and just being able to share that with us and share these things that we can learn from you. So I do appreciate it, brother.
No doubt, man. Yeah, I'd like to talk about it again sometime soon, and then maybe once this Christ myth stuff calms down, we could talk about what you wanted to talk about earlier, which is the Black Hebrew Israelites. I'd like to do that if you're up for it.
Yeah, definitely, because that's another thing that I see is growing a lot, especially in our area in Cleveland. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio area, and they've never been out there like that before, and now it's growing, and there's more and more of them each and every Saturday. Not a great big group, but they are growing, and I definitely want to address that because we have conversations with them, and I know you have in the past as well, and so anything that I can learn from another brother who's been out there doing it and talking to them would definitely be appreciated, and I'm sure for the listeners as well, because like I said, we're a bunch of street preachers listen to the show, so we're out there and we run into these guys, and it would definitely be helpful, brother. So I would really would like to do that. So when that's done, I'll get back in touch with you and try to set something up for that. That'd be great, brother.
All right, man. Ricky, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, and props to G220, G220.
All right. Thank you, brother.